By the dying days of March 1945, the Third Reich was not merely losing, it was disintegrating. The Thousand-Year Reich, which had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga, had shrunk to a burning ruin in the heart of Central Europe. Yet, as the Allied armies closed in like a vice, there remained one final, psychological and physical barrier protecting the sacred soil of Germany, the River Rhine. For centuries, the Rhine had been more than just water, it was the moat of the Germanic gods. A mystic border that no invading army had crossed with ease since the days of Napoleon. For the Allied commanders, crossing it meant the end of the war, but in the High Command, the war against Hitler had, in many ways, been replaced by a war of egos. The rivalry was no longer between the Allies and the Axis, but between the two titans of the Western Front, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery of Great Britain, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. of the United States. To the north, Montgomery was preparing a masterpiece of military theater, codenamed Operation Plunder. Monty's plan was typical of his cautious, methodical genius. He had amassed over 1 million men. He had stockpiled 60,000 tons of ammunition. He had summoned thousands of artillery pieces and an armada of heavy bombers. Montgomery intended to cross the Rhine with the weight of a sledgehammer. A spectacle so grand that the world's press would have no choice but to crown him the conqueror of Germany. He set his date for March 23, and he fully expected the Americans to wait on the sidelines and applaud. But George Patton did not wait for anyone. He despised Montgomery's caution. He loathed the idea of playing second fiddle. And above all, he hated the thought that the British might steal the glory of the final kill. While Montgomery was still counting his artillery shells, Patton was racing his Third Army through the Palatinate with a manic energy. He turned to his staff and issued an order that would define his philosophy of war. Forget the plans. Forget the preparations. Find a soft spot, and go. I want to be across that river before Monty even wakes up. On the night of March 22, at the sleepy river town of Oppenheim, there was no thunderous artillery barrage. There were no waves of heavy bombers turning the earth to ash. There was only the sound of crickets, the rushing of the cold black water, and the quiet, rhythmic splashing of paddles. The 5th Infantry Division, under Patton's direct command, slipped their assault boats into the Rhine in total silence. The German defenders on the east bank were looking north, paralyzed by the noise of Montgomery's preparations. They never saw the knife coming from the south. By the time the first German machine gun opened fire, it was too late. 6 battalions of American infantry were already establishing a bridgehead. Patton had crossed the greatest barrier in Western Europe without losing a single regiment. It was a tactical masterstroke, a theft of glory committed in the dead of night. As the dawn broke and the combat engineers frantically assembled pontoon bridges, the heavy armor of the Third Army began to roll across. It was here, on March 24, that George Patton performed the most infamous, vulgar, and symbolic act of his career. As his jeep rumbled onto the swaying pontoon bridge, he ordered his driver to stop. The general, dressed in his immaculate uniform, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the sun, walked to the edge of the floating bridge, with the eyes of his men and the newsreel cameras upon him. Patton unbuttoned his trousers and urinated directly into the Rhine River. It was a gesture of supreme contempt for the Nazi regime, a primal act of dominance marking his territory. He buttoned up, knelt down, and grabbed a handful of German dirt. mimicking William the Conqueror. He then dictated a telegram to General Eisenhower that dripped with sarcasm. "Dear Ike, I have crossed the Rhine. For God's sake, tell Monty I did it before he had time to change his underwear." At that moment, George Patton was a god of war. He was invincible. He believed the war was a grand game, a sport of kings, and he was the undisputed champion. But as his tanks roared deeper into the heart of Germany, leaving the Rhine behind, the atmosphere began to shift. The adrenaline of victory was about to be replaced by a cold, suffocating horror. April arrived with a deceptive beauty. The German countryside in Thuringia was blooming, the hills were green, the villages picturesque. But as the 4th Armored Division pushed toward the town of Gotha, the wind changed. Tank commanders, men who had smelled the cordite of the Bulge and the rotting cattle of Normandy, began to report a new scent drifting from the pine forests. It was not the sharp smell of fresh death, it was a thick, sweet, cloying odor, the smell of decay that had been industrialized and concentrated. On April 4, a reconnaissance unit stumbled upon the source. It was a facility near the town of Ohrdruf. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a military base. It was a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. The gates were open. The guards had fled. When the American GIs entered Ohrdruf, a sub-camp of the notorious Buchenwald, the war ceased to be a game. The first thing they saw were the eyes. Hollow, sunken eyes staring out from skulls that looked too large for their shrunken bodies. Men in striped pajamas, weighing no more than 60 or 70 pounds, shuffled toward the tanks, too weak to cheer, too traumatized to smile. They touched the steel of the Shermans as if testing to see if they were real. But beyond the survivors lay the true nightmare. Piled like cordwood in the mud were the naked, emaciated bodies of those who had died in the final days. They were stacked in sheds, left in open pits, their limbs tangled in a grotesque mosaic of death. The ground was covered in lime, but it could not hide the smell, nor could it hide the truth. On April 12, Generals Eisenhower and Bradley joined Patton to inspect the camp personally. Patton, the man nicknamed Old Blood and Guts, the warrior who had slapped a soldier for cowardice, walked through the gates with his chest out and his jaw set. He expected to see the brutality of war. He was not prepared for the brutality of genocide. They were led to a woodshed where the SS had massacred 30 prisoners just moments before fleeing. The blood was still pooling on the concrete. The brains of the victims were splattered against the wood. A surviving inmate, a skeleton of a man, tried to demonstrate to the generals how they had been tortured, how they were hung by hooks, how they were beaten for stealing a potato. Eisenhower's face turned into a mask of stone. Bradley could not speak, but Patton, the Iron General, cracked. The biological revulsion was too strong. He turned away from the bodies, walked behind a barracks, and violently vomited. The man who had lived for war had finally found something that war could not justify. He refused to enter the next room, saying, "I cannot. I simply cannot." The shock quickly transformed into a cold, terrifying rage. Patton realized that the enemy he had been fighting was not just the Wehrmacht soldiers in gray uniforms. It was a demonic ideology that had allowed this to happen. He realized that just a few miles away, in the town of Ohrdruf, German civilians were living in clean houses, baking bread, and sleeping in warm beds, claiming they knew nothing of the hell just up the road. Patton exploded. He ordered the military police to march into the town, He didn't care about rank or status. He ordered the mayor, the baker, the banker, and their wives to be dragged out of their homes. He forced them to march up the hill to the camp. It was a procession of shame. The well-dressed German civilians were forced to walk past the open mass graves. Patton made them look. He made them stand downwind of the bodies so they would have to breathe in the scent of their own complicity. Some of the women fainted. Some of the men wept. Most just stared at their shoes, refusing to look at the corpses, desperate to maintain the lie of their innocence. That night, the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife went home and hanged themselves. They could not live with what they had been forced to see. Eisenhower, shaken by the experience, initially hesitated to publicize the camps, fearing the images were too graphic for the American public. But Patton, regaining his composure, intervened with a foresight that echoes to this day. He understood the nature of human memory. He understood how quickly the world would want to forget. He ordered every cameraman, every photographer, and every journalist in the Third Army to come to Ohrdruf. He told them, "Get it all on record now. Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the track of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." He was right. Without the evidence gathered by Patton's army that day, the Holocaust might have faded into myth. From the triumphant urination into the waters of the Rhine to the retching sickness in the mud of Ohrdruf, George Patton had traveled the full arc of the human experience in less than 3 weeks. He had gone from the highest peak of military glory to the deepest valley of human depravity. As the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, Patton found himself a man out of time. The war, the only thing he had ever truly loved, was over. The peace that followed felt alien to him. He was a Roman gladiator standing in a modern shopping mall. He would not survive the peace long. Just months later, a freak car accident would take the life of the man whom the entire German army could not kill. But on that day in April, amidst the horror of Ohrdruf, the general with the ivory-handled pistols left his greatest legacy. He forced the world to look at its own reflection in the mirror of hell. And he ensured that we would never be allowed to look away.